Hello and welcome to this webinar from Switchboard. We will be starting in just a few moments, just as we allow folks to trickle in. While we're waiting, just want to say thank you for being here. We're really looking forward to today's webinar and the expertise that we have on board with us today. All right, hello again and welcome to today's webinar entitled Accessing Federal Student Aid for Newcomer Youth and Adults, the latest guidance from the U.S. Department of Education. This webinar is brought to you by Switchboard, a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by many speakers, but for the first part of our session, our speaker will be Lindsay Dusard. Lindsay is a Switchboard subject matter expert with a great deal of experience in navigating the many challenges of federal student aid for newcomer students, and we are so lucky to have her with us. Just a couple quick tips for today. We are using Zoom webinar, which is different from the settings in a Zoom meeting. So you'll be able to join via audio if you check your audio settings at the bottom left of your screen. If you toggle that caret, please be sure to make sure that your audio output is appropriate and correct for your devices. Next, we have disabled the chat for participants due to the large number of participants we'll have. However, we do have the Q&A function available. So if you go to the bottom bar at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to open that. And you can use the Q&A function to submit questions that can be seen by hosts and panelists. And we will be responding to those throughout the session, but do know that there is also a dedicated time for Q&A in the last 30 minutes of our webinar. In addition, we want to acknowledge that many of the clients that we're serving in newcomer services are vulnerable populations, and we want to be sure we're doing what we can to protect the confidentiality of those folks. So please, when writing questions in the Q&A boxes, be sure to not put in any personally identifying information, any information about names, addresses, those sorts of things. Please try and keep questions as general as possible there, while still trying to meet the need and get at what your question is asking. The webinar is being recorded today, and the recording and resources will be shared out following in the 24 hours following the webinar. So those should be our quick tips for today's webinar. Like I said, if you have any questions about how any of the content going on, please use the Q&A box. So our learning objectives for today's session are as follows. By the end of the session, you will be able to, 1, summarize the purpose and process of submitting the free application for federal student aid, FAFSA. 2, determine which legal statuses currently qualify as eligible non-citizens for federal student aid purposes. 3, identify common obstacles to obtaining federal financial aid and strategies for overcoming them. And 4, locate and share additional secondary education and/or career school. Going over our roadmap for today, our roadmap will largely follow our learning objectives for today, but one thing we do want to highlight is that 5th portion, this Q&A session. So our speaker, Lindsay, will be working with us for the first hour or so and talking about the content and some of these important updates to federal student aid for eligible non-citizens. But then we will be following up with a Q&A session with our friends from the Federal Student Aid Office, the Office of Postsecondary Education, rather. So please know that we will do our best to answer questions throughout, but we do have a lot of content to cover today. So most of the questions will be addressed in the last half hour of the webinar. All right, so we just want to get a sense as we're starting of who is in the room with us in this webinar. So we'll be using a Slido code today, and we'll have 3 Slido questions just to get this pulse. So if you can take out your smartphone or go to your web browser and type in slido.com and put in the code there, 1608339, and answer this first question. Again, just to get an idea of who is in the room with us. Which best describes your role in supporting clients' access to post-secondary education? So if you're an employment specialist or caseworker, if you're a youth programs manager or coordinator at a resettlement agency, if you're an educator or a director, or you find yourself in a leadership position as well. While it does say other to write in the chat, I also want to acknowledge that our chat is disabled. Apologies for that. However, if you can put that in the Q&A, we will end up dismissing that. But just to get an idea of who you are, we're happy about that. We're happy to see that. Got a lot of employment specialists and caseworkers. All right, and a lot of others. So I imagine some of you guys work on mentorship programs. Some of you are mentors yourselves. A career pathway specialist I see as well. Really helpful to get a sense of who y'all are. We're going to proceed to our next Slido for this session, acknowledging that this is still open, but we also want to get a sense of what kinds of organizations and agencies you are affiliated with. So same thing as before, which best describes the organization that you work for or are affiliated with? Wonderful to see so many resettlement agency staff. Grateful for y'all here. All right, quite a number of resettlement agency staff populating in this session. Other community-based organizations, staff. Wonderful, we'll let that stay open for another couple seconds. All right, thank you. We'll make sure that our content is particularly delivered in a way that's helpful for resettlement agency staff in particular, but we'll make sure that things are accessible for folks no matter what organization you're affiliated with. All right, we've got one more question for y'all. This next one is just to get a pulse check on your confidence level. Coming into today's webinar, how would you rate your level of confidence supporting clients through the federal student aid process? 5 being very strong, 1 being very weak level of confidence. While you're filling this out, hopefully you feel affirmed in knowing there is a wide spread of levels of confidence around this. I'm sure there are some people who have been doing this for a really long time and are very confident around some of the ways to navigate this for newcomers. There may be a lot of new folks who might not have quite the institutional knowledge, but that is all right. Today is a day where we're going to be discussing updates that affect everyone across the board. And we're really looking forward to having a really good conversation, especially with that Q&A session with our friends from the Office of Postsecondary Education. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our subject matter expert, Lindsay Dusard. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's so great to be here with you all today. I just want to thank everyone that's joining now, joining in the future. I'm really glad that you could be here with us. Thank you for taking time to introduce yourself as well. It's always helpful to get an idea of who's here. And like I said, grateful you could join us. I want to preface this with knowing that navigating federal student aid may not be the most exciting or thrilling process that Switchboard offers resources and support around. But I hope by the end of this, I can convince you that this is one of the most impactful tools that you can have in your toolbox in terms of supporting clients. I'm sure, as many of you are aware, being able to access federal student aid is often what determines whether a client is able to pursue their post-secondary career goals, et cetera, in the United States. And so hopefully you'll walk away from this today with a little bit more knowledge of resources, where you can go, and how to advocate for students if you do run into issues with the institutions that they're attending. So one thing before we get any further, I just want to clarify, we are going to be almost solely talking about federal student aid today. And if you are familiar with this, undocumented students do not qualify currently for federal student aid. And so if you solely work with that population of students, Unfortunately, a lot of this isn't going to be relevant for the work that you do. And so I just want to put that out there immediately, give your time back in case that is the group that you work with, just to make that clear. And as you saw in the chat, we have a wide range of folks that are joining us here, some that have been probably doing this for a long time and could tell me a lot about their experiences, and some that are very new to this. And so this webinar is really meant to build on some of the resources that I had put together in the past for Switchboard. One in particular is the webinar that we did about 2 years ago. And so that webinar really deeply dives into kind of the whole process of applying for financial aid for ORR eligible populations, and provides kind of a more nuanced approach to it. We have case studies in that webinar, et cetera. Whereas this one is going to kind of speed through those pieces a little bit more so we can really spend time focusing on the latest released guidance. Similarly, the toolkit is also going to be available. We just completed an update to that, and that should be available to everyone within the next few days. And this is a written form. So depending on how you prefer to access your information, those are two things that are going to be available to you. And so if we get through this first section, especially, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm still really lost, I want you to feel confident that there are other things that you can go to review in case anything is still confusing to you. Okay. So just to give you an idea of where this first section is going to go, like I said, it's going to move pretty quickly. We're just going to briefly talk about financial aid. We're going to introduce the Federal Student Aid Office at the U.S. Department of Education. And then we're going to walk through the federal application or the free application for federal student aid. I apologize. And then talk through some of those different requirement pieces. So what is financial aid? So financial aid is considered any sort of money that is used to help pay for college or career school. So funds can be used to cover expenses such as tuition, fees, room and board, books and supplies, transportation to and from school, et cetera. And there are many different sources of financial aid. And so when we're thinking about supporting clients and preparing for paying for their career and college or career schools, it's important to think about all of these different resources. We'll return to this at the end, but for the purpose of today's webinar, we're really going to be focusing in on the federal piece. But keep in mind, like we said, that there are other options. There are other ways that individuals could access funding. So Federal Student Aid is an office of the U.S. Department of Education. I'm sure most folks are aware of this, especially if you have been in the U.S. for any period of time. So FSA is responsible for managing the distribution of student financial aid assistance that was authorized under Title IV of the Higher Education Act of 1965. It is the largest provider of student aid in the country and distributes over $150 billion in financial aid to students. Which is in a really extreme number. Next slide, please. And so federal student aid, that money comes in several different forms. And so those include grants, loans, and work study programs. So first we'll focus on grants. And if you've worked at kind of any time with students in this capacity, the Pell Grant is typically our client's best friend. And so the Pell Grant is funding that is given to students who demonstrate financial need assistance paying for college and career school. And this is money that is given up to 12 semesters across the time that they're pursuing a bachelor's level or less education. And so this academic year, it was up to about $69,100, and next year it will raise to over $7,000 per academic year. And again, this is up to, so depending on the individual's household size, their income, their family's income, et cetera, as well as their enrollment status, this could differ. There's also the Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant, and this is funding that's administered to the institutions themselves. And then the institution is able to use their discretion to redistribute those funding to individuals that are still not unable to cover the full cost of tuition or fees. The last one that I wanted to include this time was the Teach Grant. And so this is a separate grant program that's specifically for individuals that are interested in pursuing education or work in high needs education areas. And so this grant, the other two grants have no service requirement. They don't need to be repaid. But for the Teach Grant, there is a service requirement. So after receiving this money, individuals are required to work in a qualifying school for a certain period of time, depending on the funding that they received. But if a student that you're working with, a client that you're working with is interested in pursuing a career in education, this is definitely something to look into. The next category are loans. And as we all know, loans can get really tricky. And generally speaking, in my experience, I've always advised students against taking out loans whenever possible. There are a lot of really great resources that Federal Student Aid has put together in recent years to help understand the financial implications of taking out loans. And how interest accrues over time, and to be able to make a more informed decision about whether or not it's the right decision to take out loans to pursue education. So again, this is just something that you need to work very closely with your client on, make sure they understand what that means for them long term. And if it is the decision for them, it's what they need to do to pursue them. There are several options here, some of which are subsidized, unsubsidized, and some that if the student is either a grad student or if it's a parent is able to take out those loans. And the last piece is federal work study. And so these are positions that are on campus for students specifically designated for those that have demonstrated financial need. And so this money is coming to students in the form of a paycheck. They're able to spend that money at their own discretion, but it is kind of a designated position that is sponsored through Federal Student Aid. So when we're thinking about who should apply for FAFSA, the first thing is for most programs demonstrating financial need. And so in terms of working with clients in their first few years, typically that is the case as they're working to establish themselves as well as their families. The next piece is to be a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that piece and really breaking that down of understanding who exactly qualifies as an eligible non-citizen. The next is having a valid social security number. And so this is just for the individual that's applying. We'll talk about families with mixed status later in the webinar. There's some other things such as being registered for selective service. They must be enrolled in an eligible degree or certificate program. And so depending on what they're pursuing in the institution, it may or may not qualify to be funded by Federal Student Aid. They must be enrolled at least half time, maintain satisfactory academic progress, which is typically at the discretion of the school as to who determines what that means. And the last piece is another thing that we'll talk about more later today, but they must have completed a high school diploma or an equivalent of a US high school diploma abroad. There's also opportunity to complete a GED, which a lot of clients end up pursuing once they're in the United States. There's also an opportunity if they're looking to enroll in an eligible career pathways program. There's some ability to benefit alternatives, and that's explained more in the toolkit, and we can provide links to that later on if anyone has questions. But this would be an alternative if someone's simply looking to pursue a career pathways program and doesn't want to pursue a GED, doesn't have a high school diploma. There are some alternatives that they can pursue. And like I said, we'll be focusing on this eligible non-citizen piece. Just to give a quick idea, so the free application for Federal Student Aid is an online application. It's also available in print form in which you can fill it out on paper and send it in. I recommend filling it online if you can, just because there are lots of data validation things built in and that help you make sure that you're moving through the process correctly, answering all the right questions. But it's a good idea when you're thinking about filling out this application with a client or a mentee is to get an idea of what information is required on the FAFSA. And so we have links in the toolkit to that paper version of the FAFSA, the PDF, in which you can review to get an idea of what's really going to be asked of the student. I've been in so many situations where I meet with a client, we think we're going to get through the whole thing, and it turns out like we don't know when their parents got married, or there's all of these little details that we aren't sure of. And so we end up having to meet again. And so if you get an idea of what's going to be asked of the client or the mentee early on, it can make that process much smoother. So I definitely recommend looking at the PDF. To give a general idea, there's a lot of personal contact and identifying information that's required, as well as information about financials. And so we're also going to speak to that later in the webinar. But the way that the FSA calculates what a student is eligible to receive is based on the income of themselves as well as their families, if applicable, in the previous year. And so having access to that information is something that is part of submitting this application. So once the application is submitted, and for the clients that we work with, they indicate that they're an eligible non-citizen, this information is sent to be reviewed by the Social Security Administration as well as the Department of Homeland Security. And so if there are any discrepancies in what was entered, the institution is going to be required to do a third step verification. And so that means that the individual will need to bring in whatever documentation that they have to demonstrate that, yes, they indeed qualify as an eligible non-citizen. At that point, they'll be considered for federal student aid. And so this really depends. Oftentimes within the first year that a student is applying at an institution, they'll need to present that documentation. So it's always just a good idea to keep that in mind. In terms of advocating for students, schools are required to give students at least 30 days to provide immigration documentation. So if there's any issues with doing that, know that that's within their rights. And similarly, if for VOTs, victims of trafficking, they will never pass the DHS match just because of the way that their status is administered. And so all of those students will be required to provide a certification of eligibility to the institution. Okay. And then similarly, you might know about this process as well if you've been through this verification group. So a certain amount of applications are selected for additional verification, which is administered by the institution. And so there are 3 different active verification groups. The first one being V1, which is really looking at just the information that the student submitted. So this is getting back to the financial information that they submitted, things about their household size, number in college, things of that sort. Typically, this is in a PDF form that's sent to the student or an online form that they'll fill out that the school will request of them. There's also 2 others, V4 and V5. These have been updated recently, which is exciting for us. They've removed the requirement to submit proof of high school completion. And so this was something that was challenging for a lot of the folks that we worked with who needed to flee quickly and weren't able to have access to that documentation. And so instead of presenting proof of high school completion, students will need to submit a statement of educational purpose for those 2 groups. I want to make sure that it's very clear that states as well as institutions might have their own rules about whether or not a student needs to provide a transcript in order to be admitted and in order to enroll in classes. So the rules that FSA, even though FSA has removed that requirement to present a transcript, they still might be required to present it to the institution itself. And so it's important to keep in mind that process as well. So these rules are separate. Institutions are allowed to have their own rules in terms of who they accept and admit into their programs. But in terms of qualifying for FSA, that requirement of presenting a transcript has been removed. And this is just to try to visually understand the FSA timeline. And so the FAFSA is open expands across 3 calendar years. So it opens in October 1st of the previous award year, and it will close on January 30th of the ending of that award year. But even though it's open for that whole period of time, it doesn't mean that institutions or states don't have their own deadlines. And so it's really important to pay attention to this because most states and institutions base their funding and awards on information that's provided through the FAFSA. So one example would be the state of Maryland. And so they have their own state administered financial aid that's based on the FAFSA. And if you don't submit your FAFSA before March 1st, before the school year starts in August or September, you will not be able to receive state level financial aid. Similarly, universities I know often have rules about that. Sometimes those deadlines are even early in January. And so it's important to be paying attention to, particularly for students that are planning ahead, students that are in high school that are looking to apply for institutions afterwards, that you're paying attention to all of those deadlines. Best case scenario, if you're thinking about planning, programs within your office to be able to support students through this process, having them as early as possible within October, November, December, getting all of those FAFSA applications out of the way is best practice, because that means that we can guarantee that that's not going to be a barrier in terms of them accessing other opportunities from state and institutions. So I'm going to give everyone a moment to breathe and digest, and also just take some time to submit questions about this section in particular. I know that was a lot. We went very quickly. We will certainly do our best to cover any questions in the Q&A session at the end, but just take a few minutes. I'll give everyone a moment.
And I also want to assure everyone, if your question has not, has not been answered in the Q&A box, that means we're likely saving it for the Q&A session later on. Those of you who may have a question, be sure to also check the answered questions already in case your question has already been asked.
Okay, so we'll move into the next section, which is where we're really going to dive into what does this mean? What is an eligible non-citizen? And this is where we have the latest guidance from the U.S. Department of Education. So most of the information that we covered previously is going to remain consistent from past webinars and the past toolkit. This section has been updated based on changes. So certain non-U.S. citizens can qualify for Title IV aid. This is the full list of them that's available in the FSA handbook. So as you can see, it pretty much directly lines with who we would consider an ORR eligible population. The ones that we're going to spend the most time on that have changed within recent years are the ones that will be highlighted on the next slide. So these individuals, we're going to break down, talk through why certain folks qualify, why certain folks don't. And hopefully this will help. I also will do my best to touch on special immigrant juveniles, as well as kind of the broad category of unaccompanied refugee minors in this section as well. But we'll definitely feel free to ask questions about that, and we can dig into that more in the Q&A session. So the big question, at least I was asking, when the first wave of Afghans were coming that were being paroled into the country is, okay, they were paroled. That's one of the categories that qualifies as eligible non-citizens. Why aren't they automatically eligible? And so there is this additional kind of fine print within that category that generally parolees also must provide evidence that they're in the United States for other than a temporary purpose. Okay, I imagine a lot of you have run into this and seen this as well. And so then what counts as evidence, right? We know that our clients are here, most of them have intentions to stay. But what is currently only qualified as evidence is submitting a form I-485, which is an application for a green card, or an I-130, which would be a petition for an alien relative and being named as that relative from a petitioner. What does not count as evidence is an application for asylum. And so that is what has caused some early issues when folks were first arriving. And so in the past 2 years, due to conflicts abroad, ongoing unrest, the Department of Homeland Security has introduced 3 new humanitarian parolee programs. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with Uniting for Ukraine, as well as the Afghan parole program, and then the most recent being the process for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And so we're going to focus most of our time talking about those specific programs. But I want to really reiterate that if an individual has been granted one of these other statuses, they are eligible through an existing process. So for instance, if a client has been granted asylum after being in the United States, they would be considered an asylee. They would be able to be eligible through an existing category. Similarly, if an SIV has been granted lawful permanent residence, et cetera. So it's important to keep in mind that these statuses kind of have a higher ranking of maybe the initial status they were admitted under. And as long as they have one of those statuses, they would go through the normal process of qualifying for FSA. So like I said, we're going to break down each of these in detail, but this is just to kind of give us an idea of what we're talking about. Okay, so as you can see, the first four categories are Afghanistan, Ukraine, Cuba, and Haiti. These are all countries in which there is legislation that's been enacted by Congress that gives these groups access to the service and programs that refugees have access to. And because of that, there have been given exemptions in terms of providing that evidence that they're in the United States for other than a temporary purpose. So an individual from those countries simply must be paroled into the US. They don't have to be paroled for at least a year, and they don't have to have one of those other forms filed. Similarly, if one of those in the middle column, if one of those individuals has been paroled into the US and they file for asylum, they still qualify. Filing for asylum in no way takes away from those four populations being able to qualify. So you can see in the last category is where we bring in everyone else. So if an individual is paroled into the US for at least a year and they've filed either an application for a green card or they filed that petition, they qualify under the FSA's existing policy. And so this is where it comes in, specifically thinking about special immigrant juveniles. So if an individual has been granted that status and has submitted an application for a green card, then they would qualify in that last category. If they have not yet submitted an application for a green card, they do not have sufficient documentation to qualify for FSA. Okay. So we'll break down each of these countries to talk through it a little bit more. So for Afghanistan, the authorizing legislation that enables individuals that have been paroled into the US during this time period is the Afghan Supplemental Appropriations Act. Related statuses here are SI and non-SI parolees. So this is just a lot of text, which is probably something maybe you want to screenshot or you want to think about later. But with the way that the currently, and it's been updated recently, is that through July 31st, 2021, through September 30th, 2023, if an individual from Afghanistan is paroled into the United States during that time period, that is enough for them, that is sufficient for them to be considered an eligible non-citizen by FSA. So those individuals do not need to be paroled for at least 1 year, although most of them have been. And they do not have to demonstrate they're in the US for other than a temporary purpose by submitting one of those two eligible forms. Documentation that's accepted for those two categories is listed below. This is, the documentation that they should have. This isn't anything special. So as long as they are considered an SI parolee or a non-SI parolee, that information should be here. Something that I want to point out that is we've just recently kind of come aware of is the first bullet on the non-special immigrant Afghan parolees list. So that electronic form 194. That form is not explicitly written into the FSA handbook, and it has not explicitly been written into the Dear Colleagues letters that have been released. And we have had at least one client that's running into them being denied by their institution for FSA because they have an I-94 with a COA of AOR. So FSA has been aware of or made aware of this. They're working on edits to it. We have resources that we can give you all if you are running into this issue yourself with a client. The thing to do is to refer back to the DHS SAVE fact sheet for Afghans, which it does list this as one of the eligible documents for proof of status. So just want to put it out there, that's not currently listed. That's why that asterisk is there. And we're working on it. Hopefully it will be taken care of soon, but know that those clients do qualify. Another piece that has come up is this family-based eligibility. And so this is more thinking long-term. I'm sure most of you have seen this. The dates don't really make sense. Just don't think about it too much. So if someone has been paroled into the United States after September 30th, 2022, and they are the spouse or child of an Afghan, or they are the parent or legal guardian of an unaccompanied citizen who had been paroled into the US, those individuals are also eligible. They also have the same exemptions of not being required to be paroled for at least a year and don't have to have that approved evidence. This won't begin until next school year in 2023-2024. So again, this is something to just keep in mind as we're moving forward. There are two other callouts in the FSA handbook, so I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted them. The first is special immigrant conditional permanent residence. I haven't come across anyone with this status, but I imagine some of you have. And so know that those individuals are qualified as conditional resident aliens. And so that's one of those existing FSA eligible non-citizen categories. And so these are the documentation that's listed there is accepted. Similarly, special immigrant lawful permanent residents. So these are folks that were granted through the SIV program. Those folks are considered lawful permanent residents. Again, one of those existing categories, so they will qualify. They don't have to present any of that documentation since they should have their green card. So next we'll talk about Ukraine. As you'll see, this is pretty much going to mirror the Afghan exemptions almost directly. So the authorizing legislation that gave individuals paroled from Ukraine access to refugee services is the Additional Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act. And they're Uniting for Ukraine parolees as well as other Ukrainian parolees. Both are considered as long as they have been paroled from Ukraine. So similarly, the dates are listed here. So if individuals were paroled between February 24th, 2022 and September 30th, 2023, they are not required to be paroled for at least 1 year, although most have. And they're not, again, required to present any additional documentation, any forms of submission as proof of being in the US for other than a temporary purpose. The documentation is listed here that's accepted. Again, feel free to take a screenshot or refer back to this. All of this information is pulled directly from the FSA handbook. It's also always available to you. And similarly with folks from Afghanistan, Ukrainians that are admitted after September 30th, 2023, who are the direct family member of an individual, so either the spouse or a child or the parent or legal guardian of an unaccompanied child, are able to access these same benefits. And so they have the same exemptions. Again, this eligibility will begin next school year. And the last piece is talking through the newest humanitarian parolee program. So individuals that are paroled from Cuba and Haiti do qualify for this exemption through existing legislation that's been around for decades. And so Section 501E of the Refugee Education Assistance Act of 1980 provided that individuals that were paroled from Cuba and Haiti could access services that were available to refugees. And so anyone that qualifies as a Cuban Haitian entrant will therefore qualify under the Cuban Haitian entrants category of FSA non-eligible or non-citizen, eligible non-citizens. So this just explains this more. There's a really great ORR fact sheet that helps understand exactly what documentation is accepted for this. But definitely something to keep in mind, because this is, if you are, if you have these folks in your community that you're working with, know that they are eligible through this pathway, and they are also exempt from providing that additional documentation. We will talk through an additional kind of case study situation in the next section about specifically Cuban Haitian entrants, but just keep in mind that these individuals are qualifying because of existing legislation. So the last piece is talking about individuals from Nicaragua and Venezuela. So even if these individuals have been granted humanitarian parole, there's currently no legislation that does entitle them to the programs and other benefits available to refugees. And so unfortunately, having humanitarian parole alone does not meet FSA's non-citizen eligibility requirements. And so in order for individuals from these two countries who've been granted humanitarian parole to qualify for FSA, they would either need to be granted asylum, or they would need to have filed an application for a green card or that petition for a relative. So if you want to go to the next slide. This is meant to summarize that again. So we're coming back to the same thing. We've talked through why individuals from the first 4 countries are exempt from that requirement, again, because there is existing legislation that entitles them to those services. We've talked about why Nicaraguans and Venezuelans are still required to have filed an I-4485 or an I-130, as well as individuals from other countries. So again, thinking back to special immigrant juveniles would also fall into that category. When we think about supporting clients in that situation through this process, I know it's very frustrating. I find it very frustrating, especially when it seems, kind of arbitrary sometimes who receives what and who has access to what. Always encourage you to advocate, with your representatives about these sort of things, and encourage clients to, pursue all options for them to adjust their status to one of those qualifying statuses. So I will take another break here, give everyone a moment to digest, put anything into the Q&A box that you've come across or you've thought of. Seems like we have a lot of really great questions coming in, so hopefully we'll be able to address most of those. If there's anything that we don't get through in the webinar today, we're more than happy to answer those things afterwards. And so please feel free to drop them in the chat. If you have specific questions, like Rob said, please try to be as general as possible. And we want to avoid sharing any personal information about clients. All right, so this is our last section of a lot of information. I know this has been a lot, and I really apologize. I really thought through other ways that we could present this that wouldn't be so lecture-y and only rules and processes focused, but unfortunately, I think that's what it comes down to for this sort of information. So hopefully, even if you're not digesting everything in this moment, you'll know where to go to get some of the answers to the questions that you might encounter in the future. So the next section, we're going to talk about overcoming common challenges. And so this section is one that we really got into in the last webinar and that we write about a lot in the toolkit. And so we're going to kind of, again, speed through this faster than I would like, but I hope that you'll be able to access, if any of this sparks your interest, or if you realize that you've encountered one of these situations with a client, please refer back to those other resources to get support. So the first one we're going to talk through is dependency. So I really regret taking out a slide that I had here that was focused on kind of pre-qualifying situations that would allow someone that is under the age of 24 to qualify without having to do a dependency override. So I'll back up. And so if a student is under the age of 24, unless they have one of these pre-qualifying situations or one of these is relevant to them, they have to provide information about their parents, both their parents. And so in the situation where we're working with individuals that are coming to the country, without their family members, that have been separated from their family members, this process can get really tricky because FSA is basing, these calculations about aid eligibility off of kind of this household income, this idea that their parents should be supporting a student in the way that FSA is kind of structured currently. Makes it complicated for students that may be coming from, non-traditional homes or backgrounds. And so the first kind of line of defense to this is there are about 10 qualifying situations that excuse a client from providing information about their parents. And several of these could be relevant to our students. The first, the most obvious, is being older than 24 years old. So once a student is older than that, they do not have to provide information about parents. The next is being married before applying. And so if a client is under the age of 24 but is married, they don't need to provide information about their parents. Some other things would be if the child is an orphan or has been an orphan or been in foster care at any time since they were age 13. And so that in cases in which a child has lost their family or lost their parents, that is one of those pre-qualified situations. Similarly, if the student has been determined to be unaccompanied homeless youth or unaccompanied at risk of homelessness, self-supporting, etc., that's another one of those pre-qualified situations. And so when you're filling out that FAFSA application, you'll come to this question where it will ask about the student's dependency situation, and you'll want to select the answer that is most relevant to them. If they are in a situation that is not one of those pre-qualifying situations, the financial administrators at the individual institution have the ability to do a dependency override. So even if they have family members, they haven't had contact with them in years, the financial aid administrator can possibly be able to do a dependency override on a case-by-case basis. And so this is what this kind of first section really gets into, is understanding what would qualify for students with unusual circumstances. If a student has come to the US, but they are still in regular contact with their family member, their parents abroad, they still would need to report information about those family members. As stated in the FSA handbook, unusual circumstances include abandonment by parents, abusive family situations, and students being able to unlocate their parents. So if a student was separated from their family, if they're unable to contact them, that could qualify as an unusual circumstance and warrant a dependency override. Where kind of we all come into this is the fact that documentation in this process is really critical to whether or not a financial aid administrator is going to be able to administer or to offer a dependency override. And so as a caseworker, as a mentor, being able to document and provide information about the student's situation is really critical. And so in most cases, this documentation is going to exist from a third party. So from a caseworker, from a mentor, someone that is very familiar with the situation. There's an example in the FSA handbook that talks about an uncle providing that information, writing a statement to describe those circumstances. So that's a piece, and we're going to talk, documentation is a huge part of this when we're getting into unusual circumstances with students. FSA or financial aid administrators have to have something to base their decisions on. And so documentation, as we'll talk about, is critical. So steps to ensure successful processing. Again, if a student already has or meets one of those independent student qualifiers that are listed that I talked through, they just go ahead and check one of those and move on. They're not going to be asked to provide any information about their parent. If they have been separated from their parent, if they don't have contact with their parent, you'll have to select "I'm unable to provide information about my parents," and that will allow you to skip that section. So you won't have to enter any information there. But it's your FAFSA application, that student's FAFSA application, is automatically going to be rejected. And you're going to have to go with the institution, work with the institution to get that dependency override. So again, that's best way to do this is to be proactive, to contact the financial aid office, to talk to them, to describe the situation, and to understand what documentation would be needed for them to perform that. So as I mentioned earlier, in terms of families with mixed status, if a parent does not have a social security number, they should enter all zeros on the form. They should not enter a taxpayer identification number. This will only complicate matters. So just have them enter all zeros. And they're not going to be able to create an FSA ID. And so we didn't talk about this much, but in order to sign the online application, FAFSA application, there's a match process that's done with your social security number to prove that this parent is related to this child, et cetera. And so they're not going to be able to complete that match process since they don't have a social security number. So instead of submitting online, you're going to print that application out, sign it, and mail it in. And that student will still be eligible to receive Pell Grants, et cetera, but the parent will not be able to access Parent Plus loans, which is one of those loan categories. But in most cases, students are really just accessing the grant funds, and that's sufficient. Okay, so I know I saw a few questions coming in about this already. So the idea of this FSA applications being based on income, and this is really easy if a client has been in the country for a few years and they've submitted taxes, and you can just automatically import the information from IRS, and it makes things so quick and simple. However, if that's not the case, it can get a lot more complicated. And so if a parent has not filed taxes at all, there's an option to enter how much the parent earned from work rather than specific information from a tax form. So you just really want to pay attention to the options in the form and then make sure you're navigating towards that. Individuals that are in US territories or in foreign countries who are not required to file tax returns. So this could be anyone that's potentially coming from a refugee camp situation. A signed statement certifying their income is an option. So if they were working in some capacity, a signed statement describing their income, you can keep it in the currency that the money was earned in, and signed statement. If there was no funding earned, you would write that. Institutions can accept a transcript from a government. So this might be particularly relevant to folks coming from Ukraine, Afghanistan, or from Cuba, Haiti, et cetera. If they have filed taxes in their home country during that year, they can provide those transcripts. So whatever they received back from the tax authority within that government as their information. So if they did file a tax return either in their home country or their host country, you would select a foreign tax return as the option. So you'd say, I've already completed it. I submitted a foreign tax return, and you're going to be asked to submit a copy of that tax return or tax information, depending on what's available, if selected for verification. Can go back one slide. Yeah, there we go. And if you did not file taxes, there's an option to say that you're not going to file. And then you just need to be prepared to submit any proof of income that's available. Again, this is a time where documentation comes in, writing a statement explaining that the parents or the individual wasn't working previously. There was no source of income, detailing the situation, the status that they have, their arrival date, et cetera, if the individual is selected for verification. So we already talked about this a little bit. So Cuban Haitian entrants, individuals with, if they are not from Cuba and Haiti and their parole is expiring, typically that would mean that their application is rejected. But given the information that's defined and kind of these exemptions that are defined in the Refugee Education Assistance Act. Certain documentation that's showing that the holder is a Cuban Haitian entrant continues to convey their status even if the expiration date has passed. And so if a financial aid administrator is not familiar with this status, they might say, this individual, like their status or your parole has expired, you don't qualify. But there's a specific exemption for this. And it's important, specifically if you're working with these populations that you know this well, that you can point folks to the right information so that they don't get rejected wrongfully. So to ensure successful processing, just make sure that they select that they are an eligible non-citizen. Make sure, always double check when you're entering the ARN and the social security number to make sure there's no issues coming up there. And if they are selected for verification, if they are coming, the institution is coming and saying, you don't qualify, the FSA handbook is always your best friend. And we have lots of links to it and specific sections. And it will provide guidance to the federal aid administrator on how to properly enter that information in the SAVE system. It's also helpful if they're able to provide an I-797. This is kind of based on a recent TA request that we got in. And so this was a case where an individual from Afghanistan was on a military base and their name was written down incorrectly and they wanted to correct their name. But the situation was that they had already created an FSA account before they corrected their name. And so if this is the case, whether it's, they're correcting their name from a mistake that was made during processing, or they get married and are changing their name or changing their name for other reasons. These are just some tips for going through that. So since all of these, like we've talked about, these organizations are very interconnected, DHS, SSA, and FSA are all working together in order to match this information and to identify who's eligible for what. So in order for you to enter a changed name in a FAFSA application, it has to be officially changed with the Social Security Administration. And that can take some time. And so make sure that, if this is a process that a student wants to go through, that they're doing this well in advance of hoping to submit their application. So once the name has officially been changed, they would either create an FSA ID with that new name with their Social Security number, or if they've already created an FSA ID, you need to make sure that you update the information for the FSA ID, because otherwise the application will be rejected. You won't even be able to submit it. So to do that, you can update the information in the FSA ID under personal information, under settings. So you'll log into their account. There's a section that you can navigate to kind of their profile, and you'll want to make sure that the name has been updated to exactly match the first and last name on the Social Security card. FSA will verify that. You can check the match status under personal information as well. And once it indicates that, yes, it's been matched, everything's clear, then you have to go back and make sure you've updated the name in the FAFSA application as well, because it won't automatically copy over. And once you've done that, then you'll be able to submit. So just keep in mind that there are two places that the name needs to be updated if they've already created an FSA ID. I think we already talked through that. Just make sure that if you're continuing to encounter issues where it says not matched, calling the Social Security Administration to make sure it's been processed is a great first step. And then just double checking to make sure the name was entered exactly correctly. And just, again, make sure there's these two places that it needs to be checked on the FSA or the FAFSA. And this is where I think most of our collective stress comes from, is working with financial aid offices. So now you kind of have all this information under your belt and you're like, okay, my clients are eligible. I'm going to make sure they are able to access this funding to help them pursue their goals. And then you run into issues with the institution that says, no, they're not eligible, or denying them for certain reasons. And I think my first thing would just to remember this is a complicated process for everyone, and to try to always enter this with patience. It really doesn't help if we go in frustrated or angry. So just understanding that this is a complicated process for everyone. There have been a lot of changes specifically related to the populations we work with in the past few years that, folks might just really not be familiar with. Like I mentioned with the FSA handbook being, having that kind of oversight of not including the I-94. I mean, they're going off of what they know, right? And if we, it's just important to have patience and to come equipped with the documentation that we have access to. So the FSA handbook is your best friend. Any information from DHS is really helpful in advocating. And then going through these sort of slides can help give you confidence that, yes, I'm right. Yes, my client should qualify. And so that you can advocate on their behalf. It's just some quick tips, if possible, accompanying your client either in person or virtually to appointments can often be very helpful. Unfortunately, that's the case, that sometimes it requires an extra person in the room to really push things forward. If it's more related to specific requests that a client might have difficulty remembering or understanding, asking them to record the conversation, of course, asking the permission of the FA financial aid administrator. Email is another great way. That way you can be copied on it. That way you have a running list of documentation in case you're running into issues that you need to escalate. All of these things can be helpful because really small details can really make a difference here. So just keep that in mind. And the last thing is just to keep in mind that, institutions are required by the federal government to do this verification process. They're not trying to be mean. They're not trying to be a bad guy for asking for extra information. And it's kind of our responsibility of helping clients through this process is to make sure that individuals have these documents ready to provide, that we have an idea of what they could be asking for. Like we looked at those verification groups. We talked about some of these other dependency override things or potential questions that could come up related to foreign income, and to be ready to have that to provide that information back to the school if requested. Because at the end of the day, if you don't, you're not going to get aid. The student's not going to get aid. And that really, like we said, really makes a difference in terms of them being able to pursue their goals here. I'll just give a brief moment. I know we're already at 2, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Once again, want to repeat that if your question that you've submitted has not been answered by one of our moderators in the chat, that's likely because we're saving it for the Q&A portion following Lindsay's last section. So thank you so much for those who have asked questions. Keep them coming. We're really looking forward to digging into those more. All right, and we can go ahead and hop through the last one. So this last section is really just about additional resources to help you with this. Obviously, hopefully this webinar is helpful to you. Hopefully this updated toolkit will be helpful. But there are some other things that we really encourage you to look to. The first two being federal student aid resources themselves. It's a lot. There are long pages, but it's helpful to be able to point folks back, specifically when we're working with institutions, to things that they know, that they're familiar with, that they trust. And so pointing folks to Dear Colleagues letter, to sections of the handbook are all really great resources. There's some other organizations listed here that have provided additional resources, whether that's for working with mentees, being able to pursue other scholarships and financial aid opportunities, etc. And like I said, these are always going to be available to you. This webinar was recorded. The past webinar was recorded. We have the new toolkit coming out. So make sure you refer to those as kind of your first line of defense if you have questions. And I think a big piece to keep in mind is there are a lot of requirements for going through this process, and not every client is going to receive enough federal student aid or even receive federal student aid to cover their education-related expenses. As long as the student is considered one of those eligible non-citizen categories, we strongly encourage you to still submit the FAFSA. Because it is used for a lot of other, calculating a lot of other rewards, applying for private scholarships, researching financial aid opportunities in your state. I would really strongly recommend that you have a good understanding of that process for whatever state you're working in.
and also encourage students to talk to counselors or other financial aid officers that might be able to help with them.
All right, thank you again, Lindsay. Really grateful for your expertise on this matter and for covering so much content in such an efficient and effective way. We'll now be moving on to our Q&A panel portion as promised. Please continue submitting questions in the Q&A box. I want to I'll have them introduce themselves in just a moment, but just to give you an idea of who is on our Q&A panel, first of all, my name is Rob Callis. I am a training officer with Switchboard, and I will be the moderator for the panel. So I will be doing my best to comb through the questions that you have asked and make sure that our panelists are able to answer them well. We're joined by Aaron Washington and Brian Schelling from the Office of Postsecondary Education. You may have seen them chatting and responding to some of your questions in the chat, of course. So they have a good idea of some of the questions and priorities that you have in mind. And of course, Lindsay will be continuing on in this webinar as a Q&A panelist as well. So welcome to you all. We're going to stop screen sharing so you can get a better view of all of us. All right, so welcome again, Aaron, Brian, and Lindsay. I just want to start us off by having you all sort of give a quick intro of who you are, what you do as it pertains to federal student aid, and why you feel this is important when talking about working with newcomers. If I can start with Aaron.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Washington. I work in the Office of Postsecondary Education, Policy, Planning, and Innovation. And my office is really responsible for issues related to regulating the Title IV aid programs. We have to go through a process of notice and comment whenever we want to update, change, or rescind the regulation. And a part of that is being knowledgeable on policies that affect certain eligibilities for students, institutions, or programs. One of the first things that I was assigned, one of the first times I got when I arrived at the department about 10 years ago, was to become one of the subject matter experts on non-citizen eligibility. So this is something that I've been working on for quite some time, and it's near and dear to me.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Brian, go ahead.
Sure. I work on the same team that Aaron is on in the Office of Postsecondary Education. I used to work in the Office of Federal Student Aid, and when I was there, I worked on a number of volumes of the FSA handbook, including the student eligibility volume, which contains all the guidance pertaining to the issues we're discussing today. It's been a while since I dealt or since I worked heavily in that area. So Aaron has more recent experience with issues around immigration and citizenship. My expertise lies even more in the area about general FAFSA information, filling out the FAFSA, student eligibility still to some extent, but also other questions related to tax data information that you have to put on the FAFSA. And so these are issues I've been working with for quite a few years now, and so that's why I'm here.
Fabulous, thank you, Brian. And last but not least, Lindsay.
Hi, you've already heard me talk far too much, so I want to make sure that Aaron and Brian will be kind of leading this section, and I'll jump in if there's anything else I can add.
Fabulous, thank you, Lindsay. Go ahead, Aaron.
If I just say one thing, thank you so much, Lindsay, for the presentation. I just wanted to clarify one point just before we jump in regard to selective service and eligibility for federal student aid. That is just the idea that somebody assigned the sex of male at birth would have to register between the ages of, I believe it's 18 and 25 in order to establish eligibility for certain federal public benefits. The Department of Education no longer considers that in regard to their Title IV eligibility. Now, the question still appears on the FAFSA, but financial aid, we've released, our guidance documents are called Federal Register Notices or Dear Colleague Letters. And we released a Federal Register Notice and a Dear Colleague Letter. And beginning actually in a previous award year, the 21-22 award year, the department no longer considered that. So if a student, let's say they fail the match process between the selective service and the department, the financial aid administrator would note to disregard that, and the student would have fulfilled that because they're not more, we don't take into consideration, so they don't have to fulfill that eligibility requirement.
Thanks so much for clarifying that.
Wonderful. All right, so as I'm moderating, I just want to draw out a couple of themes that we're seeing throughout the Q&A box. One thing that I want to draw attention to is, Lindsay, when we were on that slide about verification groups, there were a couple of questions and there was a little bit of confusion around, how you can tell and how you can identify sort of which verification group that folks with various statuses find themselves in. For example, someone had asked about victims of torture. Where might they find themselves in the verification groups? Would anyone be able to speak more on how you would best be able to identify where you land there? Additionally, we can show that slide again if it's helpful.
Yeah, I can take that real quick. As far as I know, there is no sorting of persons into the verification groups based on what their immigration or citizenship status is. So these three different groups are determined based on other factors, including information that you put in from your tax return and other things.
Great, Brian. So, go ahead, Aaron.
No, that is correct. Just to add on to what Brian says, when a student submits a FAFSA, the school is provided with something called an ISER, it's Institutional Student Information Record, and the student gets a SAR, the Student Aid Report. And on those documents, the school will see what verification tracking group the student was selected for, whether that's V1, V4, or V5. And Lindsay talked about, well, you see all the requirements on that. And so the financial aid administrator, the financial aid office would then be required to reach out to the student to tell them exactly what they would, what documents that they would have to submit to the school. But that's all I wanted to add.
Great, and sort of a follow-up here while we have this slide. We had one question about, about these statements of educational purpose. Someone was asking, what does that look like? So could any of y'all share about what would qualify as a statement of educational purpose?
Yeah, that appears on the FAFSA. That just basically says that the student is going to use the federal student aid they receive for the purpose of paying for their educational program. In effect, that's what it states.
Okay, so that's embedded right into the FAFSA, and there's not an additional form, or is there a letter that anyone needs to also add to their FAFSA as well?
Well, sorry, I should have noted as well that if they're asking to verify that, then they'll have to verify that again. They'll have to reaffirm that is their intent to use their federal student aid to pay for their educational program. And it also requires them to verify their identity with an ID card typically.
Awesome, thank you, Brian. Anything to add, Aaron?
Yeah, so we release, so financial aid administrators are very familiar with our verification suggested text. And so when we release, every single year, the department releases the groups, or the V1s and V4s, the groups that we have selected to verify students for, and also the acceptable documentation. And so we also, in collaboration with that, we really suggest the text. So if the financial aid office uses that text, then that will help them fulfill all the requirements of verification. In that suggested text, we have written out the statement of educational purpose that the student would have to sign. I won't read it to you, but I did answer one of the questions in the Q&A chat. I don't know if everybody can see those answers, but I provided the link to the verification suggested text, and you can just control search statement of educational purpose, so you can see exactly what a student will have to sign.
Awesome, super helpful, Aaron. And yes, participants should be able to go to the answered column of the Q&A and should be able to find some of those questions. So keep your eyes peeled for something on SEP or statement of educational purpose. All right, I want to shift gears a little bit further to talk about we had a question here that says, with regards to Ukrainians, Cubans, Haitians, and Afghans, it seems like as long as they have their parole status, they're wondering about this sort of filing of the form I-589. Is that something that's relevant for Cuban, Haitian, Ukrainian, and Afghan parolees?
The Form 589 is just the application for asylum. So depending on how someone is navigating their legal status options here in the US, I know there's a lot of just kind of ambiguous situation that these folks are stuck in right now. But the reason I included that there is just to ensure that if someone does file for asylum, like I know many Afghans and Ukrainians are, that does not disqualify them. They'll still, that parolee status of being admitted from one of those countries still qualifies them as an eligible non-citizen.
Okay, and Lindsay, that's actually a great segue to another sort of question theme that's coming up is people who are, have not been granted asylum, but people who are applying for asylum. Can you go over again sort of the considerations that asylum seekers, folks in the middle of asylum, of applying for asylum might have to keep in mind, like if they have a work permit, but they don't have asylum yet, what should those sorts of students do?
Unfortunately, unless you've been granted asylum, you are not eligible for FSA until that point. Unless you have one of those eligible categories or you've been granted one of those other eligible statuses, you won't be eligible to access federal student aid. It is important to keep in mind, though, that there are a lot of other options, particularly a lot of states have a lot of state financial aid options for students that are either undocumented or pursuing documentation. So keep that in mind. But at the time, if someone has not been granted asylee status and does not have a parolee status from one of those categories that we discussed, they would not be eligible.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. Brian or Aaron, anything to add for those working with asylum seekers who might be looking for ways into higher education?
I don't know.
Nothing to add. I just wanted to clarify. I think we talked about Venezuelans and Nicaraguans. Was that part of the last question? And so I just wanted to clarify as well. So those, and Lindsay discussed this, but their eligibility would be different from Afghan parolees and Ukrainian parolees. So they would have to be paroled for at least 1 year and also have to have an application for lawful permanent residency on file with the Department of Homeland Security. And so they wouldn't be able to have, if the SAVE system returned a response of I-589 filed, they wouldn't be, and consequently they wouldn't be eligible for federal student aid.
And to quickly jump in for TPS as well, because I know that's another common question. Individuals that only have been granted TPS similarly do not qualify for federal student aid. They're free to pursue other options through state and institution level financial aid, but keep that in mind unless an individual has been granted one of those statuses that was listed on the eligible non-citizen category, they are not eligible for FSA.
All right, I had a question theme also around filing taxes, everyone's favorite topic. I'll start with a scenario sort of based question. Someone said they had a client who applied, had completed the FAFSA form in the fall of last year, and they're wondering if they need to resubmit updated tax information for the past year of 2022.
No, when you fill out your FAFSA, and I answered at least one question similar to this in the chat or in the Q&A portion. When you fill out your FAFSA, it asks you for taxes from the base year, which is the prior year or 2 years previously. So that's the data. The data from that tax return is what you'll use. And in some cases, for most students who are American students, they have their tax data, it's with the IRS. They can actually port that information over from the IRS's database now and into the future as well, into their FAFSA. So, but with immigrants and other students that we're talking about, they would just, they might need to just use the tax data from their tax return. And it might be information from another country. That's also possible too, and they would include that on their FAFSA from that tax year.
Thank you, Brian. All right, one of the themes that's also coming out is around delays for processing different applications for social security numbers for a variety of statuses that folks are applying for. Folks are seeing significant delays in getting social security numbers granted. Is evidence of applying for a social security number sufficient when completing the FAFSA?
No, unfortunately, no. You have to have a social security number. In rare cases, there are students from certain Pacific islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau, Marshall Islands. Those students don't need to have a social security number. In other cases, students generally need a social security number.
All right, thank you. Another question on sort of this, Lindsay, what you mentioned, that parolees who might be currently applying for asylum. We have a lot of questions around sort of these statutes of limitations around, when parolee program eligibility starts and when it finishes, depending on when someone arrived, that sort of thing. Just the general broader question of, for folks who are on parole now, but are worried about parole expiring and those sorts of services expiring. What are some considerations that you guys think this will have on students, and what are some things that students can be doing now while they are still eligible to stay on top of these sort of policy changes that are happening? I think Afghanistan and Afghan parolees are a great example that maybe we can add some context and color to.
You gonna go, Lindsay, or you wanna go first?
I think I'll pass it to you. I mean, I'll just quickly say that, Aaron and Brian are working off of, they're kind of at the request of Congress, what they're passing. And we know it's been extremely frustrating that the Afghan Adjustment Act hasn't been passed yet, that we haven't been given real answers about people's long-term status in the US. And so I don't know, Aaron, feel free to jump in, but a lot of this is just based on what is able to be passed by Congress. And so I don't know if we necessarily have answers for what the next, year is going to look like, unfortunately. But Aaron, if you have anything else to add in, please.
No, the Department of Education itself does not confer status or designation, and the financial aid administrator is directed to go off of what has been conferred by the Department of Homeland Security to the student. And generally for parole, once the parole has expired, well, for the Afghan and Ukrainian arrivals, they're subject to like those flexibilities. But for parolees, and once those flexibilities expire at the end of the term of parole, they would be held to the same standard as all other parolees, 1 year, also with the I-45 on file with DHS. For all other parolees, there is in the Federal Student Aid Handbook, you will note that students are not eligible for federal student aid after their parole has expired. So they're no longer eligible for any subsequent disbursements of federal student aid after that has expired. That's just, that is a part of the Department of Education's policy.
Yeah, thanks so much. And that clarity around sort of the legislation and sort of the implications on the Department of Education is really, really helpful as well. All right, I'm acknowledging that many of the remaining questions get kind of into the nitty-gritty sort of pieces and have to do with a little bit of clarification on things. So I'm going to ask this one really quick. I work with a client who has 4 names on his Social Security card. How should those be entered on his federal student aid account? He was flagged during the matching process because they weren't entered correctly. So maybe a question also about when names might not line up between an educational institution, what's on a Social Security card, what's with USCIS. If there are sort of name discrepancies, what would y'all recommend is the best way of sort of navigating where names might not be consistent across all of these platforms? Who are the right people to talk to?
Aaron, did you want to take that?
Well, we do have some guidance, and I can't remember what the chapter is in the Federal Student Aid Handbook, but it's all in volume 1. So like all of the student eligibility requirements are in volume 1. We do have some suggestions for the student. The department itself could not go to the Social Security Administration and ask for, an update to the student's name. So the student themselves could, work with the Social Security Administration to have their name updated, work with DHS, USCIS to have their name updated in their systems. But if there is a discrepancy between the matches, then the student, the student may want to work with those agencies to have that updated. The student would need to, the financial aid office would have to be able to confirm that the student is the name and the date of, that's what this SSA match confirms, is the name and the date of birth. And that the financial aid administrator would have to be, have left with no reasonable doubt that that's not the student in order for the student to establish eligibility. And that would likely entail the student working with those agencies to have their names updated. So that's the best advice that I could really give.
Yeah, Aaron's right. Also, even before you get to that point, the student should just, to the best of his or her ability, try to put the name on the FAFSA that is in SSA's system, because that's where the match occurs. And so if they match up, then they're good to go.
Like we talked about, like that process is like, it's a no-go. If you can't submit, if the SSA match is not done for the FSA ID, you're not going to be able to submit the application. And so my advice would be to call SSA, like their office, talk to them, ask them how their name is divided up in their system so that you can exactly reflect that when you're submitting the application. And similarly, doing a double check with USCIS to make sure that that is consistent across those two agencies.
Thanks so much. And I'd love to echo something also that Lindsay said earlier is, excuse me, work with a caseworker and go with someone for any of these calls if you feel like you need advocacy or any support that way. It could be some of these just small administrative snafus that could be leading to sort of these system errors. So yeah, make sure that we're working with folks who can advocate for us in the system as well. We've got time for maybe one more question that I can pull from here. Sort of a scenario-based question. The biggest issue that this person runs into with clients is the parents are not able to complete their portion due to low English levels and lack of digital literacy, including email access, when applying for the FAFSA, and I imagine going through the parent portal. We are able to find workarounds, but sending in the signature page delays the process greatly. What are some solutions, recommendations, or accommodations that y'all would give to ensure students can complete their FAFSA if they have parents who are, like I said, low English literacy level or low digital literacy? What would y'all recommend as workarounds there?
Well, what first comes to mind is typically in those kinds of situations, the student helps the parents because the student can speak English and can help the parent through the application. That's usually what happens. If for some reason that's not able to come off, then it's up to the student, the parent, the school, the financial aid administrator at the school to try and figure out how can we get this done. So it's always better if you can complete everything electronically. That's just more efficient. It goes faster. There are helps online that you can get. So those would be my suggestions. I don't know if Aaron has anything you might want to add.
I looked at Lindsay, maybe. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I wonder if there's just some more nuance to the situation. For instance, like if the parents are abroad, things of that sort that are making this, really much more complicated. For instance, like if someone is in another country and they need to sign a paper, all of that I can certainly understand is complicated and something that maybe we can connect with after this. But generally speaking, I mean, when I was doing this regularly with students, I mean, we would talk to the parent that yes, this is what we're doing, but most of the time it's like us, filling out everything together and then making sure the parent is like signing off on the FSA ID and confirming it with their email and all of those sort of things. But there are a lot of steps to this process. And so if you are needing to do some of those specifically with a student, trying to get as much information from the student as possible, working with the parent whenever is possible as well. But I recognize that, sometimes you're limited with virtual visits or in-person visits that the parent's not able to attend, et cetera. So I think it's just the process of going through. But like I said, the abroad piece, we can certainly connect on more.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. And I agree. I think that was, go ahead.
I did a quick search and I did on our financial aid toolkit at ed.gov, and it says information about language assistance services is available at 1-800-USA-LEARN. So that's USA Learn. But it does mention that the U.S. Department of Education says does make interpretation and translation services available for inquirers who speak languages other than English or Spanish. And so that number was provided, or there's an email address, ed.language.assistance@ed.gov. So that could potentially be a resource.
Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. We love those accessibility features. All right, well, we are at time, unfortunately. Great questions. Thanks to those who have submitted those, and we hope we've done our best to answer those well in the time that we had provided. Hopefully
Can I add?
Oh, yeah,
Can
Brian,
I add one thing real quick, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. I noticed a fair number of questions could have been answered as well by this Federal Student Aid Information Center. That's a terrific resource that people should avail themselves of. They have call, chat, email options. I'll get that I'll get that information to you and Lindsay, and I assume you can send that out to the people who attended.
Absolutely. And if anyone on this webinar has any questions specifically when working with refugees and other newcomers, you can always reach out to us to stay connected, and we can put you in touch with the right people to talk to. So hopefully now that we've reached the end of our webinar today, you're able to have achieved all of these things that we've discussed and gone through. We want to ask for your help also in providing some feedback to us. For those of you who are still on the line, if you could take 30 seconds to just pull out your phone and scan that QR code, or you can click the link that has been dropped in the chat to fill out this important feedback form. It's a short 3-question survey, takes less than 30 seconds to fill out, and it makes a drastic difference for the technical assistance that we provide from Switchboard. So if you could just take a moment to fill that out, we'd be very grateful. All right, and in closing, I just want to say thank you again to our guest speakers and their expertise. Thank you to Aaron, Brian, and Lindsay for everything that you've shared with us today. For those of you who are looking for more resources and diving deeper into this work that we're doing, we will be sending a list of recommended resources to all of you within 24 hours. This is just a small sample of some of the things we'll be sending, including a link to that updated toolkit for federal student aid that Lindsay had mentioned throughout. On behalf of Switchboard, we'd like to thank you for your attendance today, and we hope that this has been beneficial for you. Please stay connected with us in whatever ways you feel able to. Find us on social media. You can send us an email at switchboard@rescue.org if you have any technical assistance requests or questions about any of our resources. And please check out our website, www.switchboardta.org, where you can access our full resource library full of 1,000 different things to address all of your refugee service provision needs. Thank you so much again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next learning opportunity.